Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Father John Markey. He is a Dominican priest. He is associate professor and director of the PhD program of spirituality at the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas. He has been assistant professor of theology at Barry University, Miami Shores, Florida, assistant professor of systematic theology and philosophy at St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore, Maryland, visiting professor, Seattle University School for Theology and Ministry in Seattle, Washington, and assistant novice director, Dominican Common Novitiate in Denver, Colorado. B.A., Master's, University of Notre Dame, Master of Divinity, Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology at Berkeley, and Ph.D. Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. That's a lot of merit badges, Father Markey, with the greatest respect. So wonderful to have you on the show, speaking to us via phone from San Antonio. You're going to be coming to Albuquerque through the Dominican Ecclesial Institute to give a wonderful presentation and also talk about your book, Moses in Pharaoh's House, subtitled A Liberation Spirituality for North America. Welcome, Father Mark.
Well, thank you. That was that was quite an introduction. I really appreciate that.
Tell me a little bit first about yourself. If you can give us a little insight into your path to the Dominican order.
Well, I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and kind of a normal childhood, not anything extraordinary, but went off to Notre Dame, University of Notre Dame, which for us was the great urban north. You know, it was quite an excitement to go up. And got interested there. Actually, the funny thing about it is some people always wanted to be a priest. You know, I always wanted to be a professor. I don't know where that came from. Except for the fact, you know, like remember one time mowing a lawn in 95-degree weather or 95% humidity in here at home and thinking to myself, I need to find a job, a career that doesn't ever involve work or labor. And I think that's where I came up as a kid with the notion of being a professor. That was the one thing I thought could keep me from ever having to do any work. So I went off. And I was really interested in philosophy. I was kind of interested in a lot of things, and that was one of the great things about Notre Dame is I was able to kind of do all kinds of stuff. Philosophy and theology became really my kind of passion and history, and I stayed at Notre Dame to get a doctorate in medieval thought, and about halfway through that doctorate I realized I was really less interested in thinking about the Middle Ages than living in them, and that I really wanted to study contemporary philosophy and theology. So I left. I only knew one Dominican in my life, but what I was really in love with was the name of the Order of Preachers. I just thought it was such a great name, and to be honest, that it's kind of a weird reason to choose a religious order, but that drew me more than anything else, and so I eventually did join the order and went back, and they immediately sent me back into a very contemporary setting to study philosophy and theology, and gave me the opportunity simultaneously. I mean, one of the great things about the Dominicans is you kind of end up doing 10 things at once, and which for me it has always been a real blessing that, you know, I'm not limited to just academic life or just pastoral life, but, you know, I'm able to combine them, and it's been a real joy that a big part of my life has been not just teaching, although I teach and write and all that kind of thing, but also that I work a lot in spirituality as actually teaching and working with Dominican spirituality and Dominican groups and the part of the Dominican family, but also that my main sideline interest that I've been able to do for 20-some years now is preach, literally, and work in parishes and work in dioceses with lay faith formation and just basically preaching and working with people on a real practical level on faith. So, you know, it's really been the best of both worlds for me. And that's what my charism is as a Dominican, and everybody's all along has encouraged it. Nobody's really ever thought that was a bad idea or that I should just focus on my writing or my teaching, that everybody's always understood the real need to be working in both ways simultaneously. So it's been a really great direction or path for me. You know, it really is my ties in with my own personality and my charisms and gifts. So I'm back in San Antonio for the first time in almost 30 years, and came back, got an opportunity 6 years ago to come back and teach. And I hadn't been around my family in a while, and that's been the most remarkable thing, to just be able to go to baseball games and soccer and take my turn with the carpool and, just to be around and to see a whole other side of life that really, to be honest, it always been kind of outside. And I see people with kids, but I'd never actually had to be responsible for any of them. And of course, the best thing of all is I have a whole new set of images and stories and things, reflections for my preaching. So, I mean, it's just been a gold mine of great insights about life. And these kids, I mean, you could take a day with any one of my nieces and nephews and make an entire half a year of homilies out of it. I mean, they're just remarkable. And so that's where I am now, and kind of really basking in that it's been really a joy to be part of a family in that way again, in the more intimate ways of just the daily life of the kids and my brothers and sisters and mom. So
from your innermost personality through the expression of the Dominican order, you truly are an itinerant preacher, which brings us to this wonderful event coming up, July 26th. Father John Markey will be here in Albuquerque. I have as the title or the theme of your talk, Gifts for the Church. Is that correct, or should it have been Gifts of the Church?
Actually, this is the funny thing about it. When I was invited, it was Gifts of the Church. And, this is... I really am the absent-minded professor. I mean, that really should be. I really fit this. Whatever anybody at home thinks about, kind of impractical life of academics, I'm the stereotype of it. So I think when I agreed to the talk, we had another talk in mind. That was maybe the talk that I was invited to give. But I'm really more interested in giving this one about gifts for the church, because I think one of the interesting things Francis has been trying to point out, Pope Francis, is that in some ways the church is a gift to us. It's a gift to the world. It's a gift to people individually in their lives and their own quest for sanctity and for spiritual growth. But on the other hand, the reason we do that, the reason we participate in the life of the church and join in the life of grace and grow in sanctity is not for ourselves. It is not so we just can be happy or that we can feel fulfilled or that we can find God or something. We're doing that so that God, in a way, can find us and use us to serve the world. That it's not a self-centered or narcissistic church, that it's actually fundamentally about sending people out. That the whole thing, the whole church is in mission to people and to service of people in their ordinary lives and the real circumstances of their life. And so I think that in some ways I tend to do both in my talks around the country, which is I think there is a group of people, and rightly so, that feel, maybe rightly so, I don't want to judge either, but they feel like they don't understand why the church is important, how it fits into their lives, et cetera. And so I do a lot of times try to explain to them, especially when I teach undergrads in these groups, why it might be that the church is really in some ways different than they think, first of all, and what its purpose is might be more essential to their lives than they realize, because the culture doesn't quite articulate or make sense out of why you should belong to any social union or any deeply committed community of people. I mean, most peoples have very limited, they belong to lots of groups and they do a lot of stuff, but they don't feel deeply, fundamentally committed to some organization or some community. So I spent a lot of time just explaining why the church, how does it fit into the Christian message, how does it fit into the gospel, how is it really a gift Jesus Christ gives to us for our sanctification. So that is a talk I give, but I also feel like that I'm always trying to weigh whether to preach and talk about that, or sometimes it's more important that we move forward and talk about how the church now, in this time and place, is meant to be a gift to the world, a gift to people who aren't in the church, people who feel actually alienated or disconnected or unwelcome in the church, or people who feel that way in the society. And so I think kind of my first book was about creating communion. One of my first books was about creating communion and about the church itself and the kind of trying to explain to people in some ways the value and the importance of the church for their daily lives. So that's why it's funny that you picked up on the exact issue, like which of these do you kind of talk about. But I think in conversation with the Institute leaders, they really wanted me to move forward and talk about how the church, and I think that's what Pope Francis, and your own, this wonderful new bishop you just got, who is really Francis-focused, a Francis bishop, and I think that it's important that the church can only make itself relevant, or people can understand why it's important to their lives if they see it active, serving, and out there. In other words, to just explain to them the value of the church isn't really the answer. We preach with our lives first, and then we explain it afterwards. So it's really important for me, I think, that those people in the church that are committed and active understand the importance of the church to the society that we're living in.
In this DEI presentation on July 26th, if you only spoke about what you've just mentioned, this would be wonderful. But as it happens, up your sleeve, you have a fireball that you're throwing out. Your most recent book, Moses in Pharaoh's House, the more I read the reviews and descriptions, the more exciting, wonderfully agitating, volatile, but deep the content seems. The subtitle, Liberation Spirituality for North America, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Something written about the book, John Markey argues that North Americans are enslaved by a false sense that self-centered idealism is morally good and necessary for achieving the common good. Moses in Pharaoh's House, A Liberation Spirituality for North America, explores how those living inside the oppressive structures of the first world can be freed from false ideologies to achieve personal and socio-political conversion. This review also suggests the book presents a spirituality of conversion for the privileged, that's we in the first world, develops a connection between the liberation of the oppressed and conversion of the privileged. Tell us about this book.
That's a great review. I wish I'd written it myself.
I
love when people say more articulately what I'm trying to say than I do. So that's great. Mary, the best way for me to get at this a little bit is to tell something of the story of my own life. One of the things that happened to me when I started studying theology, everybody, the rage in the 80s and stuff, when I first started, was liberation theology, and it was really fascinating because it was coming out of cultures and places that because I was a Dominican, because I was in this international religious community, I was able to visit some of these places. These poor regions of Peru and Argentina and Central and South America during the wars that were going on, the civil wars, parts of Africa and stuff, where you could see that liberation wasn't like an abstract concept. It was literally that these people were living under profound political and economic social oppression, and that by liberation, it was first of all liberation from death. That one of the keys is poverty and the kind of political oppression. And then, in the early 90s, we were doing a lot of work with people from Eastern Europe and coming from these highly where, they might have had food on their table, but that they were socially and culturally deadened by the oppressive culture, the oppressiveness of these governments. And so, it was easy to see how liberation had a real practical and direct effect. You were trying to free people from systems that were deadly, that caused death. I mean, people were literally starving to death and dying of diseases that don't even exist any longer in Europe and United States and a lot of places in the first world. And so one of the things that you saw was how liberation was a critical dimension of what was going on. It was also something that Vatican II, this isn't something that these people made up. It wasn't something coming out of Marxism or something. It was actually coming out of the council itself, that the fathers of the council were deeply concerned about the conditions of ordinary human beings in their lives, and especially that the church found itself on what they called the preferential option for the poor, on the side of those people who were struggling to deal with these death-bringing and death structures. But I come back then, I'm living in Berkeley, for God's sakes. I mean, it's like living in somebody's version of a dream. You can drink great coffee and eat all these scones and, and we're all talking about liberation theology, but liberated from what? I mean, we're in the most politically liberal place. We can vote for anything. We have I might have only got $30 a week, or I didn't even get that much. I think I got $30 a month in those days. But still, I mean, here I'm living in one of the most economically privileged, all the educational, all the health care, everything. I was living in this world, and then we're talking about liberation, and it occurred to me, well, what do we need to be liberated from? I mean, if the gospel is about liberating people from the real things, the real aspects of their lives that are destroying and death dealing, what is it for me? I mean, I don't live in economic or, the poorest person I've ever met has higher standards of living than in the United States than whole societies of people in other parts of the world. So, and as screwed up as our politics can seem while we're in the middle of it, I mean, it makes a lot of the politics around the world, it really is, it's still our country. I mean, and we have lots of control over it, even if we don't exercise it well or whatever. But so that's when I started thinking, well, what does it mean for us to be liberated? Because the gospel is supposed to be a gospel of liberation for every time and every place and every culture. And that's what, again, Vatican II calls us to make the gospel relevant, to call people to change and liberation. And that's where I realized that in the third world, and I use these terms about first and third world very lightly. I mean, I don't mean to suggest that there's some diminishment or something, but in a world where there's all this socioeconomic and political oppression, and they're suffering, there's civil wars and all this, they need a kind of direct type of intervention. So liberation makes sense. For us, I think that in the first world, in a world that's politically, socially, and economically a success, it needs a different kind of liberation. It needs to be converted. I mean, the conversion itself is liberation in the New Testament. I mean, Jesus says, the scribes and Pharisees keep coming up to him, and what is it we need for eternal life? And he says, love God with your whole heart, with your whole mind, and with your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, that's pretty much at the heart of what it means to be a Christian. It's at the heart of what it means at the gospel. And we can see that it's at the heart of every single spirituality that emerges in the Christian tradition in the West is a way, often for different types of people in different places, even different personality types, to practically love God with their heart, mind, and soul, and love their neighbor as themselves. And so, but in the United States, it seems to me that what the rest of the world needs from us is not that we be more liberated, but that we be truly converted. Then I use the book actually title that comes from Hebrews 11. And in Hebrews 11, there's this great line where he says, he's talking in Hebrews about faith and how faith saves people. And faith in this context is a faith in God who understands our destiny differently than we might or our culture might understand it. And so there's this line where he says, by faith, Moses knew that he was not Pharaoh's daughter's child, but indeed, by faith, he knew that his own destiny lay with the people of Israel. And so I've always thought that was a profound notion of the other side of the Exodus story, is that Moses, he doesn't want to be in Pharaoh. He just grows up in Pharaoh's house. He doesn't have any particular desire to be an oppressor, or he isn't organizing, the empire or anything. He just is he kind of almost inadvertently lives in this world where he begins to become conscious of the fact that it's not fair, and that people aren't treated correctly, and that what God desires isn't working out, and that his faith is not so much what he does in terms of response to God's call, but the mere fact that he saw his own kind of, and it took time, it didn't happen overnight, but that he began to see his own destiny with the oppressed, enslaved classes, rather than with the king and with the Pharaoh and with the people who were naturally his family and his neighbors and his friends, and that he started to see his own identity tied in to the identity of a people that he didn't know he was connected to at all. So I think that's in some ways what the challenge in the U.S. culture is to go through that process of conversion precisely so that we can identify, with a wider world that we don't really understand or connect with at this level. And that's why I think St. Francis is calling us as a gift to the church to precisely engage in that level of conversion so that we can be available to serve the whole church and serve it in a way that might not immediately fit into anyone's particular socio-political or economic agenda. In other words, it's something different because it's coming out of a transformation of our whole way of looking at the world, because we're looking at it through Christ, taking on the mind of Christ and looking at it from God's point of view, which isn't the way, the Democratic or Republican Party or this group or that group looks at it. It's ultimately its own way of looking at the world, and it challenges us in some ways to be different kinds of people than we are, even if we're good people. But does that make sense, or
It does indeed make sense. I'm checking off some of my topics as you already hit them in stride.
Liberation and conversion for me, because even, as I was talking to this great father of liberation theology, the goal of socio-political and economic liberation is not just that people can have air conditioners and TVs and cell phones and, vote. It's that they can be free, because, when you don't have any food, it's really hard to work on your personal sanctification, and work on your prayer life and everything. You're just trying to survive. But the goal of liberation is liberating people for Christ and for sanctification and for service to the whole church. It's not just to give them a better life, because ultimately, this life, but it's actually, this life has its own limitations no matter how. So liberation is about enabling people to be free enough to engage a genuine and holistic life of conversion. Liberation and conversion are in some ways sides of a single coin that go together, and that in our world, in the kind of U.S. cultural context, to be converted, in my opinion, really fully and completely converted in Christ, would liberate us from a lot of the challenges and problems and brokenness and hurt and negativity that consume our first world.
I'd love for you to address 2 points. One is, what do we in America, what do we in the first world need to be liberated from? Because you also mentioned that. And before we started our recorded conversation, you mentioned that there is a contemporary connection with a medieval heresy that you suggested that we entertain in American life. Can you address those points?
Right. Well, okay. So now I don't claim to have the last word on all this, but of course, that doesn't mean I don't write a book and say what I think. But what I think is there are kind of 4 walls, as it were, that are keeping us, 4 things that keep us kind of walled in American life, 4 ways of thinking that are limited, or limitations, or even false ideologies that help us keep us from really seeing the world the way God sees it. One is the kind of radical individualism that we spoke about, where I'm really only responsible for myself. I'm not necessarily connected to anyone other than my own, and meeting my own needs. And we see that the real effect of this ultimately is that, kind of with something like, I don't have any responsibility for people other than myself, including, even sometimes my own family, or even sometimes the child in my womb. That's the radicalness of the individualism, is where I feel like my needs and my taking care of myself really does come first, and that other people, even in my society, like I say, even close relationships to me, aren't my concern, or don't have the same level of importance as my own, meeting my own personal happiness.
We've made selfishness an art form.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God, it's amazing. And, the second thing I point out is that, and this is a longer story, but, that the proto-sin in the Scripture, and the proto-sin for St. Thomas Aquinas is envy. And, where we see our own identity tied up in somebody else's identity, and we try so hard to be, this covetousness, to be what the other person is, that we never really bother to understand what we're meant to be. And in the United States, envy, you can get an MBA, that's what the whole point of marketing is. And, we have a whole science devoted to developing and creating envy in people. Now, I'm not going to say that's all evil or even horrible, but it is when we so much live in this world of consumer, and it becomes a kind of ideology of, we are what we own. We are what we fundamentally, we're identified by external realities that other people recognize as important, but they don't necessarily have anything to do with us. So the car I drive, the neighborhood I live in, the clothes I wear, the titles above my head. But, in the Catholic tradition, we go before the reign of God, as St. John of the Cross says, and we're asked, the memory of who and how we loved is the only thing we take with us into the next life. And so, so there's that consumerism, the ideology of the marketplace, of free market economics. Not that, there isn't a lot of value to capitalism. I mean, in some ways it's a very remarkable economic system, but there's a difference between having it as an economic system and having it be the way you understand life.
It's not an ideology, or it's not an ideology with any depth.
Right. No, and it's one thing to have it be about economics. It's another thing for it to explain social policy and educational policy and foreign affairs and everything else. It's like, well, then it's an ideology when it becomes about life itself. And so then I say the third thing is, I think we're really a culture that is deeply superficial in a way that we're highly optimistic, but we're largely hopeless. I mean, in other words, it's a culture that's definitely afraid of death, and it's kind of the culture of get what you can now while you can, and that because you don't know what the future holds, and so that the idea that you would limit or sacrifice something good in this life for some future purpose is really a hard concept to get across to people. I mean, I teach undergrads, and even the idea, that you would give up, your sex life or your career or something so that you might serve other people, because that in the fullness of time that you'll have all of it in a kind of that there's a certain way in which that's really hard to explain to them, because they don't grow up in a world where there's really any real future. I mean, everybody kind of believes in heaven, they're going to go there, but there's no way in which we're creating the conditions for it by what we do in our own lives. And so, I mean, this goes back to something Martin Luther King always said, is he was deeply concerned about the fact that we're an optimistic nation, but not necessarily a hopeful nation. And hope is it has a different power than optimism. And so I get into that in the book. The third and the final thing is that I think we live in a nation that largely has a heretical view of God. And, as I said, I was in the part of France for 3 weeks where the Dominicans began, and Dominic comes into this world that's profoundly influenced, and the dominant theology is Catholicism, which holds that there's a good God and an evil God, and that the world is really run or at least dominated by evil, and that the ordinary natural world is evil, and that there's really no way that we can be saved except through kind of belonging to some small, very special group of people, and that almost everybody else is lost and damned, and that God is distant and judgmental and mean-spirited, and I think that there's a lot of that in U.S. culture. I mean, I cite all these studies where, we're one of the most religious cultures in the world. I mean, next to India, we're probably the most religious culture in the world. 96% of people in America believe in God. 98% of people pray regularly. 47% of people attend church services regularly. I mean, we're a profoundly religious culture in a way Europe and a lot of other places just aren't. But what God are we worshiping? It's not clear that it's the God of Jesus Christ. I mean, in these studies and surveys, almost 70% of people say that they believe in a God that's distant, angry, unconcerned with us, or mean, and basically mean, And the loving, accepting, merciful God of Jesus Christ, gets 23% of people who that's their first response to when they think of God. And I think that's a real challenge.
It would explain in our society, as people view their deity, they also emulate their deity.
Oh, sure.
So we have,
we
then have a punitive.
If you have a stingy God, you have a stingy society. If you have a God that wants revenge and wants to punish people, you don't give a second thought to spending infinitely more money on prisons than you do on education. I mean, you have no problem executing people, and you have no problem dismissing people who don't work, don't eat, and this kind of thing. So, I think very much the God we worship influences the way we act. I mean, and I think that's one of the great challenges that we're facing in the U.S. is not that a secularism like Europe where there are people who don't believe in God. I mean, people believe in God. I think they just aren't. I'm just not clear they believe in the right. They're not. I think a lot of Americans in the Middle Ages would have had a way. In the Middle Ages, if Dominic met these people, he just presumed they were all what we call Albigensians or Cathars. And they make this fundamental distinction between this world and, it's kind of like, well, what you do in this world doesn't really count because it's all kind of not real. And, I read this, watch it on TV all the time, this gospel of prosperity that God rewards certain people because he loves them, and then all these other people, we shouldn't worry about them because, they get what they deserve, and that's God's choice and there's nothing we can do about it. And in other words, I think there's a lot of popular religiosity in this country that really diverges dramatically from the tradition of the church, especially the Catholic tradition that sees grace happening in the fundamental way God communicates with us is through other people, and the fundamental way we communicate with God is through persons, other people, and that's a radical view. I mean, God becomes a human person. He doesn't, when God wants to get into contact with us, he doesn't send us an idea or a book of rules. We're not a people of the book. We're people who have a book, but we're not like other religions. We don't have a book. We have a person, a human person. And his life becomes a way of us thinking about our own lives and interpreting our own behavior, and imitating him becomes what we're really supposed to imitate and envy and desire, is to be like him, which is a very different thing than the culture tends to teach us. So in that sense, I think, I really think that a lot of what the challenge we face is not in the courts or even in the Congress or all this. I mean, it's back to what we were before. It's like what Francis says. We need to first persuade people and talk to them and preach to them about the God of Jesus Christ and the importance of that God and the reality of that God for our daily lives. And I think that that's missing. I think for a lot of people it's going to be good news.
Brings us, pardon me, I might be a heretic. Kids, don't try this at home. But that full circle journey that the Church has made from Vatican II through many iterations of how to process that, all the way to the most immediate, the encyclical Laudato Si, where Pope Francis, he presents the case that would have been the case Benedict was making against the heresies that he encountered.
Dominic, right? That Dominic.
Sorry, Dominic.
But Benedict is bound totally on board with this, so I don't want to.
Sorry. Right. No disrespect to Benedict, but I meant Dominic. This gift of life, gift of creation, gift of humanity, to then respond to the gift, try our level best at every juncture to live a life worthy of the gifts that God has given us, and to go beyond. You say it better than I do.
It's a remarkable document, precisely because, in some ways, as somebody said, and I'm not making this up. In many ways, it's like every document in the Church is really about the relationship of God's grace to our situation, how God is acting, and is an attempt to explain a God who is acting in human history, that isn't ignoring it or merely watching it from afar or observing it or judging it, but is in fact actively engaged. And it's a God who created the world and still participates. I mean, like Thomas Merton said, trees and flowers and cats all participate in the glory of God by being themselves. That there's a certain way in which the fundamental principle of Aquinas, good tends to diffuse itself into degrees of participation, that the world in its own way and in different ways, humans differently than rocks, but all of us have some participation in the life of God because God chooses this. And it's not because of some kind of some kind of mystery of shamanistic religion. It's just the fact that God chooses to create a world in which God's own identity and God's own life is tied into it. And so God is acting through practical things like, God does reach us through water and wine and bread and oil and the fundamental things that make up the earth and our subsistence. But God's mainly interested in people and human people and their lives. And that, to be concerned about what God's concerned about is to take our stewardship of the earth seriously, And I think one of the problems in the United States, it goes back to this hopelessness. I mean, most people think that there's something wrong with the climate. They're not literally denying that there's probably a crisis, but they feel so hopeless about it. They're just like, well, there's really nothing we can do. It takes such a dramatic change. I don't really want to give up my SUV, so therefore there's nothing I can do. And there's a certain way in which that kind of helplessness is a hopelessness. I mean, in other words, I think that if you believe that God is working not just to create us, but to sustain us and redeem us, that somehow in God's plan there's a way forward, but we have to be open to see it. And part of being open to see it isn't to be defensive, about my car or something. I mean, maybe it is about giving up and changing our cars and our personal behavior, but it's probably even deeper than that. It's probably at an even deeper level of change. Then that's what frightens us even more, maybe, right? It's not giving up my car that's so difficult. It's maybe changing the whole way I look at my relationship to material things.
Isn't that a primary message we get from the Gospels? That horrifying, scary suggestion that we give up everything we have and in faith follow Jesus.
Right. I mean, As people point out to me, a lot of times I talk a lot about Scripture and my addresses, and as I say, I think one of the challenges of the New Testament, why a lot of people see it as good news, but there are some people who see it as bad news. They saw it as such bad news they felt like they had to kill the person who was delivering it. I mean, one of the things we have to remember is Jesus, it doesn't die of a heart attack, or he isn't hit by a chariot or something. He dies, he's publicly executed after a public trial by both the religious and the civil government. And so it's not some mystery why he dies. I mean, these people want to shut him up and silence him, and it's because he's challenging their status quo. He's telling them, both the religious authorities and the secular authorities, that their way of doing things is not adequate to God and God's vision of the world. And they don't want to hear this. Nobody wants to hear it. I mean, it's hard. And therefore, that is exactly it. There are 32 times Jesus mentions wealth in the New Testament and prohibitions against wealth and the problem of wealth. And, so look, we live in the wealthiest, even, I get my salary goes to the Dominicans and all that. But look, I live better than the wealthiest person in the world would have 100 years ago. I mean, my education, my health care, the air conditioner I have on now, the fact that I have a car, the fact that my life expectancy is 40 years more than people would have been, even than any one of my, what generation would have had 100 years ago. I mean, we're profoundly, just by virtue of being born into this remarkable society, we live a wealthier, richer existence than anyone else in history has known. And yet the poor are living more or less, I mean, if you walked along the Gaza Strip today, you discover that it probably doesn't look much different than it did when Jesus lived there. I mean, the poor are still living pretty much how the poor lived.
In United States, in the United States,
have become exponentially richer.
In the United States, every major city now has a remarkable homeless population. So we don't always have to go to Gaza to see poverty in its most direct and dire example.
Oh, yeah, and I mean, I work here very closely with the Catholic Worker House, which works with the chronically homeless, and, they've criminalized homelessness now here and criminalized poverty, and, they've been trying to close and move this house out. They've already, and it is true. I feel sorry sometimes for the residents of the neighborhood we're in, because it is true they kind of got a bad deal. But on the other hand, nobody's offering an alternative, certainly our city government isn't, to how to handle this chronically homeless population and what to do for them so that you want them out of your parks and out of our, out of sight, but yet, it's like the capacity to do that requires that you take seriously the needs they have and not just dismiss them as irrelevant or not even worthy of, that they're just problems that you're going to push on. You're criminalizing them to try to get them to move on to the next city. That's what it really means. But so that they're not your problem. But, this is really the challenge, as you say. You're right. We don't have to go to Gaza to see profoundly poor people. I mean, especially, you and I, we live in the Southwest. I mean, we live in a world that's been largely overlooked in the rural areas and in our inner cities over the last, all the growth that's happened in our region. The poor are still pretty poor. And the living conditions are still not so great, and the education system is still vastly different for the poor than it is for the wealthy, and the medical and health care availability is that maybe there's a little more health care available when you're really, really sick, but the average kind of care that keeps you and I healthy throughout our lives is still not really readily available to the poor. So
you have
you're
so
right.
many.
It's not like I'm just talking about the third world.
Yeah, we have so many really deep, profound points. Our time is running out, and I regret it, but the good and hopeful part is that Father John Markey will be presenting Gifts for the Church at the UNM Continuing Education Building on July 26th from 1 to 3 p.m. This is put on by the Dominican Ecclesial Institute, and if you would like to go, you should RSVP, and you can do that by emailing contact@deiabq.org. Contact@deiabq.org. July 26th. Be there or be square. This is going to be mind-blowing, as they said in the 60s. The last thing that we have time for, and I do want to make sure I ask you this, how can our listeners get a copy of your book, Moses and Pharaoh's House, either to prepare for your presentation on July 26th, or if they have to miss it, at least they'll be able to read these ideas?
Oh, well, thank you. Well, it's through Anselm Academic Press, Anselm Academic, so they can always just go on the Anselm website, and that's a division of St. Mary's Press. It's a big Catholic press. Or they can go on, of course, the Amazon, which is taking over the world, does have a copy of the book, and they'll probably, and so I know it's on Amazon as well, and so they can get it there. And hopefully local Catholic bookstores will stock it.
I understand.
Have it as well, so.
I understand that there may be some books, copies of the book available at this presentation on July 26th through DEI. But I can't thank you enough for a wonderful, insightful, and thought-provoking conversation today. Look for more on July 26th with the DEI presentation. Many thanks. Dominican Father John Markey.
Well, thank you, Mary. It's great to visit with you.
All right.
And we'll look forward to seeing everyone.
Bravo. And thank you for listening to Archbishop's Hour, Catholic Radio.
For the past 60 minutes, you've been listening to the Archbishop's Hour from the Catholic Center in Albuquerque. Join us Monday through Friday, noon to 1, for the Archbishop's Hour, discussing with our guests and audience issues of importance to New Mexico Catholics and all the people of God. Thank you for listening and supporting Catholic Radio.